6th week, and we are going to be talking about death and burial and crucifixion today. Kind of heavy topics, I know, but I left these towards the end on purpose and kind of tried to coincide them with Easter. So this week is Palm Sunday, next week is Easter, and so I wanted to give you a little bit of context because we are going to be hearing a lot about those two things next week with the Easter story. So I have had so much fun these past 6 weeks getting to know a little bit more about who Jesus was, the time that he lived in, what it was like when he was alive. And I hope that you have had fun too. So let's learn about our last topic, death and burial and crucifixion. So if you look at the word crucifixion, it is actually says cruci is cross and fiction is attaching. So crucifixion means cross attaching. It was intended to be painful. It was intended for somebody to be scared of it. And it was also intended to be humiliating to people who experienced it. Under Roman law, robbers, army deserters, traitors, rebels, all of those people could be crucified. Jesus, in fact, was crucified for rebelling against the Roman government. Slave owners were also allowed to crucify rebellious or disobedient slaves. These condemned criminals were tied or nailed to wooden crosses in public places so they would be visible to anyone who was available to watch them die. And so that's why there were many people around when Jesus died on the cross. If you look at the actual cross, on the top there was a sign that told passerbys what the crime was. The sign on Jesus' cross was an acronym for the Latin version of Jesus of Nazareth, the King of Jews. So the crossbar was carried to the execution site by the condemned to fit over the upright beam. The upright beam was already planted in the ground. Sometimes the condemned was allowed a peg or a small shelf to sit their feet on so that they weren't hanging all the way. On a low cross, the condemned person's feet hung about 18 inches from the ground. Wrists, like I said, were either tied or nailed to the crossbar. And there were different types of crosses. They all had the same effect. You can see in this graphic that they weren't all in the cross that we see today, but there were different versions. So now we are going to talk about what happened after a person dies in the time of Jesus. Death was a reality, much like it is today in Jesus' world. Rich people and poor people alike got sick and they died, but their burial was based on their economic status, if they had family or not, or their religious traditions. So let's take a closer look at how people were treated after they died in Jesus' time. So the first culture that we're going to talk about is the Jewish faith. Jewish people buried their dead. Tombs around Jerusalem were carved into the limestone cliffs. They had small entry doors and were sealed with square stone plugs or covered by round slabs of stone that could be rolled away. I know that this sounds familiar because this was how Jesus was buried. Poor people were buried in shallow pits and wrapped in cloth. Jews did not use coffins, or they did not use anything to help preserve the body. Instead, they were wrapped in cloth or shrouds, a kind of linen covering. Funerals and burials were supposed to happen within 1 day of death, but funerals were not allowed on the Sabbath because that was a day of rest. Now, for Greek and Egyptians, they believed in embalming, which is another word for preserving their dead, and they would use salt or herbs. Egyptians especially were famous for carefully preparing their dead nobility, which would be kings or queens, for the next life. Greeks and Egyptians were big fans of elaborate, decorated sarcophagi, which is another word for stone coffins. Burial practices for the wealthy involved elaborate funerals. People were often buried with clothing, food, tools, because it was believed that they could help them. These items would help them in the afterlife. Poor people, on the other hand, were usually wrapped in a simple cloth and buried in shallow holes or pits. Finally, the Roman way of burial. In the 1st century, they practiced cremation or burning of the dead. This ensured that no one could tamper or mess with the body of a dead person. Ashes were collected, soaked in wine, and placed in jars or boxes, and then these containers were buried in the ground or stored at a columbarium. That's a place to store urns. Now, robbing graves or disturbing the graves was a crime, so Romans waited 8 days between death and the funeral. And thank you so much for joining me today as we talked about death and burial and crucifixion at the time that Jesus was alive. I hope this gives you a little bit more understanding when we follow the Easter story next week with Jesus. All of our Easter services will be online Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Sunday. So join us virtually for that as we talk about the death and resurrection of Jesus. We are going back in person April 11th. So if you feel comfortable, please join us in the sanctuary at 11 a.m. We only have one service on starting Sunday, April 11th. There will be social distancing and there will be masks required. So if you feel comfortable, join us. If not, we will still have our virtual Sunday school online. We'll still have our children's sermons online and, of course, our virtual worship. So again, thank you, friends, for joining me, and I'll see you next time.